On the night the river came for Kearsley, the only person awake in that town who understood what was about to happen was a 19-year-old girl sitting alone in the Telegraph office with her hand resting on a brass key. And she had perhaps 11 minutes to make 400 sleeping people believe a warning they did not want to hear from a young woman they had never taken seriously. She lost 3 of those minutes to men who would not believe her. She spent the other 8 ringing every bell and hammering on every door in that town, with a lamp in her hand and her voice going hoarse. And when the water came down the valley in the dark, most of Kearsley was standing on the high ground above the schoolhouse in their nightclothes, watching their homes go under, alive. Because a girl they had called the little miss at the key had stayed at her post when everyone else had gone home to bed. Her name was Nettie Blaine, and she had been the night operator at Kearsley for a year and a half, and the town's opinion of her had been settled long before that night, in the way a town's opinion of a young woman usually is, which is to say, kindly and completely, and without any particular attention to the facts. She was a nice girl, they said. It was a shame about her father. She was doing her best at a man's job, and it was decent of the company to let her try. The company had let her try because Nettie Blaine was the best operator in that division, and the superintendent knew it, though he could not have said so aloud in Kearsley without starting an argument. Her father had been the operator there before her, Walter Blaine, and he had taught her the wire the way other fathers teach a trade to a son, starting when she was 7 years old and could barely reach the table. And she had grown up in that little office with the smell of oil and hot brass and the sound of the sounder chattering away above her head like weather. When the consumption took her father slowly over 2 bad years, Nettie had already been working his shifts for months, first sitting beside him and then alone while he coughed in the back room. And when he died, the superintendent came down from Fairbury and listened to her send and receive for an hour and gave her the office, and the town of Kearsley never entirely forgave either of them for it. Not that anyone was cruel. Kearsley was not a cruel place. It was worse than cruel in a way that is harder to fight, which is that it was fond of her and did not believe in her. The men who came in to file a message would look past her at the empty chair as though a real operator might yet appear from the back room. They called her the little miss at the key, and it was said with affection, and it meant every time the same thing. That the wire was a serious business belonging to serious people, and that a girl minding it was a temporary arrangement everyone was politely overlooking when she told a merchant that his quotation had come through garbled and she had asked Fairbury to repeat it. He would thank her and then to wire Fairbury himself the next morning to be sure. When she said the line was down west of the bend, men would ride out to look at the line. She had learned not to mind it, or had learned to seem not to mind it, which after a year and a half amounts to nearly the same thing and costs a great deal more. There was one thing about Nettie Blaine that the town did not know, because it happened entirely inside a system they could not see. And it is the whole reason 400 people are not in the ground at Kearsley. Up and down that wire, in the offices at Fairbury and Delphos and Rouleau and the little way stations between, the other operators knew her, not by sight. Most of them had never laid eyes on her. They knew her the way operators know one another, which is by the hand. Every telegrapher has a fist, a way of striking the key as particular as handwriting, the rhythm and spacing and weight of a person coming down the wire, and an operator with any experience can tell who is sending from the first half-dozen characters as surely as you know a friend's step on the stair. Nettie Blaine's fist was clean and quick and absolutely even, the fist of a person who had been taught by a patient man and had practiced 10,000 hours because there was nothing else to do on a night shift in a town of 400 people. Her father had drilled it into her from the beginning. Keep your hand honest. A sloppy fist gets men killed on a railroad, he told her, and a nervous fist tells the whole line you are frightened, and a good clean fist is the only introduction you will ever get from a man who cannot see you. She had kept her hand honest through 2 years of watching her father die, and a year and a half of being politely disbelieved by everyone she knew. And the result was that in Kearsley she was a girl playing at a man's job, and on the wire she was Blaine at Kearsley, and the difference between those two facts turned out to be 400 lives. The water that killed the valley that spring was made a long way from Kearsley, and days before anyone there thought about it. It had been a wet April and a wetter first week of May, ground already full and creeks already high. And then a storm sat down over the headwaters above Delphos and rained for 11 hours in a way the old men afterward could not find a comparison for. None of that was visible from Kearsley. That is the thing about a river valley that nobody understands until it kills them. The disaster that arrives at your door in the middle of the night may have been assembled entirely out of weather you never saw 40 miles upstream, while your own sky did nothing worse than drizzle. What Kearsley had that evening was a grey, damp Tuesday and a river running high and brown and fast under the bridge, high enough that men stood on the bridge after supper and looked at it and said it was a good deal of water and went home. What Kearsley also had, though almost nobody in it was thinking about this, was a telegraph line strung on poles along the railroad grade that followed the river up the valley through Delphos and on to the headwater towns, which meant that Kearsley was connected by a copper wire and a series of small rooms with young men and women sitting in them to everything that was happening upstream in the dark. Nettie Blaine came on shift at 6 that evening, as she did 6 nights a week. The office was one room with a plank counter, a stove, her father's chair, the instruments on the table by the window, and a cot in the back where she slept between the late traffic and the morning, and it was the whole of her life, and she was not unhappy in it. She copied press for the paper. She sent a message for a farmer's wife about a funeral. Around 9, the traffic thinned the way it always did, and she banked the stove and took out the mending she kept for slow hours, and sat with the sounder clattering away above her, and did not listen to it in any way she could have described, the way you do not listen to your own heartbeat, which is to say that she would have noticed instantly if it had stopped. At 11 minutes past 10 it stopped being ordinary. The sounder above her head began to rattle in a way that brought her head up out of the mending before she had consciously understood why, and what she heard in it was not a message, but a hand. It was Delphos, and it was Corey Alt who worked nights there, a boy of about her own age whom she'd never met and had talked to nearly every night for a year and a half, and his fist, which was ordinarily a lazy, pleasant drawl of a fist, was coming down the wire fast and hard and ragged, and Nettie Blaine was on her feet with her hand on the key before the first full word had finished, because she had heard, in the shape of a hand she knew, that something was wrong, before she knew what it was. What Delphos sent, in the flat, abbreviated language of the wire, was that the water above them had come up 4 feet in an hour, that the mill dam above Delphos had gone out or was going, that the river was over its banks and coming down the valley in a wall and not a rise, and that Delphos was leaving. And then, in the middle of a sentence, without any of the courtesies the wire lives by, Corey Alt sent the 3 letters that meant he was quitting the key, and the line went dead, and Nettie Blaine sat alone in a small bright room in a sleeping town with the knowledge that a wall of water was coming down 40 miles of valley toward 400 people, and no way on earth to prove it to any of them. She did the arithmetic in the 10 seconds it took her to cross the room for her coat, and she did it correctly, which is the first of the several things she did that night that no one in Kearsley would have believed her capable of. Delphos was 11 miles upstream. The water was moving fast, but water in a valley is not a train. It spreads and slows and piles and comes on. She had, she thought, something between a quarter of an hour and half an hour before it reached the low ground at the foot of Kearsley's main street, and the difference between those 2 numbers was the difference between a town on the hill and a town in the water, and there was no way to know which she had. The first thing she did was not to run. The first thing she did, standing in her coat with her hand shaking on the doorframe, was to go back to the table and send, down the wire toward Fairbury and the towns below, the message that Delphos had gone under and that the water was coming, so that Rouleau and the places below Kearsley would have from her what she had been given. And she signed it with her office call and her own hand. clean and even, no faster than usual, because a frightened fist tells the whole line you're frightened. Then she pulled the fire from the stove and took the lamp and went out into the street to wake a town that did not believe her. She went to the constable's house first, which was the correct thing to do and cost her almost everything. Amos Teague was a decent man, and he came to the door in his nightshirt with a lamp, and he listened to a 19-year-old girl standing in the rain telling him that the mill dam above Delphos had gone and a wall of water was 11 miles up the valley and Kearsley had 20 minutes, and what Amos Teague said kindly was, "Now, Nettie, who told you that?" She told him. Delphos told her, on the wire in Corey Alt's own fist, and then Delphos quit the key, and Amos Teague, standing in his doorway, did the thing that men had been doing to her for a year and a half, which was to believe that she believed it. He said perhaps she had misread it. He said the line garbled things in weather. He said he would put his boots on and walk down and take a look at the river, and if it was up, they would see about waking folks, and Nettie Blaine understood with a clarity that she said afterward felt like being struck that this man was going to spend her minutes walking down to look at a river in the dark, and that when he got there and saw it, the water would already be past Delphos Ford, and there would be no minutes left for anybody. She lost 3 minutes on that doorstep. It is the only part of the night she ever spoke about with anything like anger, and she did not speak about it often and never by name. What she did next was not in any procedure and would have cost her the job on any ordinary night. She left the constable putting his boots on, and she ran to the Methodist church at the end of 4th Street, and she rang the bell. Not the slow toll for a service or a death, but the fast, wild hammering ring that in a prairie town meant fire, the one sound that would put every person in Kearsley on their feet and out their front door in under a minute, and she rang it until the rope tore the skin off her palms. And when the doors began to open up and down the street, and men came out shouting for the fire, Nettie Blaine came out of the church into the middle of Main Street with her lamp and told 400 people at the top of a voice already going to pieces to get to the high ground behind the school, now that the river was coming, that Delphos was gone. And here is the thing that decided it, and she never claimed any credit for it because it was not hers. Standing in that street in the rain was Simon Ketch, who ran the freight depot and had worked 11 years on the railroad before that, and who knew the way railroad men knew what a telegraph office was and what it meant when a station up the line quit its key in the middle of a sentence. He did not know Nettie Blaine any better than anyone else in Kearsley did, but he knew the wire, and he asked her one question, which was whether Delphos had closed properly or had just gone off, and when she said Alt had sent the quit signal in the middle of a word, Simon Ketch turned around and started roaring at his neighbours to move, to get their children and go up the hill, and a town that would not take the word of a girl at the key took the word of a girl at the key when a freight agent shouted it, and Kearsley began, at last, to move. They had, in the end, perhaps 6 minutes. People afterward argued about it, and no one agreed, which is what always happens. Mothers carried children up the school hill in their nightclothes. Men were still coming up the slope with their arms full of whatever they had grabbed, which was, as it always is in such moments, the wrong things: a clock, a birdcage, one man's account books. The Hollis family, who lived lowest and farthest out on the river road, did not come, and 2 men went down for them with a lantern and got the mother and the 2 younger children up the bank and did not get old, Mr. Hollis or the eldest girl, and that is a fact that sat in the middle of Kearsley's gratitude for the rest of that generation's life, and it should sit in the middle of this story too. The water came into Kearsley from the northwest at about 20 minutes to 11 at night, and it did not look like a wall by the time it got there, because 11 miles of valley had spread it and slowed it, and what came instead was worse in its way, a black flood 4 and 5 feet deep, moving fast between the buildings, carrying trees and fence and pieces of Delphos, and it took the bridge in the first minutes, and then the mill, and then, one by one, the houses along the low side of Main Street, and the people of Kearsley stood on the hill above the schoolhouse in the rain and watched their town come apart in the dark and listened to it, which they all said afterward was the worst part. The sound of it. 19 people were hurt that night. 4 people died, 3 of them, the Hollises, and one an old man named Pardee who went back for his dog and was not seen again. Every building on the low ground was destroyed or ruined, and 396 people who had been asleep in those buildings 25 minutes earlier were standing on a hill, wet and shaking and alive, and every single one of them knew exactly why. The Telegraph office was on the low side of Main Street. It went with the rest of it, the table and the instruments and her father's chair and the cot in the back and the mending she had left on the seat. And by morning there was nothing on that lot but mud and a piece of the plank counter. Nettie Blaine had gone into that office at 6 o'clock, owning everything she had in the world, and she came out of the flood owning a coat, a lamp, and a pair of hands with the skin off the palms. What she also had, though it took Kearsley some weeks to understand it, and some of them years, was the plain, unarguable fact of what she had done and how she had been able to do it. She had not been braver than the men of Kearsley. Several of them did braver things that night than she did, and 2 of them went down the river road for the Hollises, which she did not do and could not have done. What she had was the wire and the hand at the other end of it, and the training to know what she was hearing, and the discipline when the message came to send it on down the line before she saved herself, and the sense when the constable would not believe her, to reach for the one sound in that town that nobody could argue with. She had been given 11 minutes by a boy in Delphos she had never met, who spent some of his own last safe minutes at a key to give them to her, and she had turned those 11 minutes into a town on a hill. That is all of it. There was no heroism in it that would look like heroism in a painting. There was a young woman doing, quickly and correctly, and while frightened, the job she had been trained since the age of 7 to do. Kearsley did not apologize to her exactly because towns do not, and because in the weeks after a flood everyone is busy and stunned and there is no moment for it. What happened instead was quieter and better. When the line was restrung and the company put up a new office on the high side of the street, nobody in Kearsley asked whether a girl was going to be minding it. Men who had spent a year and a half wiring Fairbury to double-check what she told them stopped doing it all at once without discussing it. Amos Teague, the constable who had put his boots on while the water came down the valley, was never once heard to defend himself, and for the rest of his life, when the flood came up in conversation, he would say only that Nettie Blaine had been right, and he had been slow. And he said it in front of his own children more than once, which is a harder thing than an apology and worth more. And on the wire, where she had always been Blaine at Kearsley, nothing changed at all, because on the wire, nothing had ever been wrong. Corey Ault, who had gotten out of Delphos with the water in the street, and had thought for a week that he had failed because he had quit his key, came down to Kearsley in the fall to meet the operator whose hand he had known for 2 years, and the 2 of them sat on the steps of the new office and could not think of very much to say to each other, having said everything important already in dots 11 miles apart. Nettie Blaine worked that office for 31 years. She married late, a widowed farmer named Sorensen, and kept working, and trained a good number of the operators in that division, girls and boys both, and the first thing she taught every one of them before speed and before procedure was the thing her father had taught her: keep your hand honest. She would tell them that a man 40 miles away who has never seen your face will know you by your fist and will believe you or not believe you on the strength of it, on a night when believing you is the only thing between 400 people and the water. She never said that part about the 400 people as though it were about herself. Most of her students worked out where it came from eventually. What she made of the whole thing in the end, she said once to a young operator who asked her whether she had been frightened that night. She said, of course she had been frightened. She had been 19 and alone, and the office was going to be under 6 feet of water in half an hour. And then she said the sentence that the operators in that division passed around for 2 generations. It does not matter much what you are while it is happening. It matters what you practiced when nothing was happening. Now, Nettie Blaine and Kearsley are ours, but here is what is true. Telegraph warnings really did outrun floods on American rivers, and operators at upstream stations really did stay at their keys as the water came into their offices to send warnings downstream, and towns really were emptied onto high ground in the minutes those warnings brought. It is one of the genuine and underappreciated ways the telegraph saved lives in the 19th century. Women were telegraph operators from the earliest days of the wire, thousands of them, often trained by fathers or brothers. And they routinely met exactly the kind of polite disbelief this story describes, and were routinely better than the men who doubted them. The fist is real. Experienced operators identified one another by the individual rhythm of their sending, and trust on the wire was built on it. And the sudden failure of a dam or the arrival of a flood crest in a narrow valley at night was one of the deadliest events that could happen to a river town, precisely because the water is assembled out of weather that the doomed town never sees. This story is about a flood and the loss of life, which is a heavy subject, and if it touches something in your own life, please be gentle with yourself in the hearing of it. The people are imagined, the wire, the warning, and the hands at both ends of it are exactly as they were.